Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and Weiss Advice here on YouTube. In this video, we're going to be doing a mix walkthrough of the record Self-Hate by Sir Jones and Method Man. Yes, Method Man from the Wu-Tang Clan. Okay, I almost went into the rap. So, primarily I'd like to focus on the thought process and treatment of Method Man's vocal, but I also want to go through the complete record as well, just to kind of set the stage. So let's get on in and give a listen to how my mix sounds.
It in the pot, gotta serve it to the fiends, gotta push it on the block. Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about a truce. If this is stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop. Tony Stark's
I kind of just want to keep listening to the whole verse. It's really, really good. So, okay, this is where my final mix print was. The master will probably be a little bit different because the mastering engineer is going to sweeten it up and things like that, but I don't think it'll be vastly different. I'm pretty happy with what I got. So before getting into Method Man's vocals here, I want to jump into the instrumental track because I think that that will help sort of set the stage for my thought process that I took to the vocals. So I'm going to bypass all of my effects here. And let's also take off my mix bus. And let's just give a listen to the instrumental real quick. Oops, that is not actually it. This is the raw. So when I started mixing this record, my first thought was, how much Wu-Tang do I want to bring to it? Do I want something that really calls on that like early 90s, mid 90s sound? Or do I want something that feels a little bit more clear and modern and crisp? And my end feeling was, let's go clean, modern, crisp, but with a little bit of that older, like not mid 90s energy thing going on. And that sort of expressed itself in the beat a little bit. So the first place I want to start is with the snare, because I think the snare is where the biggest change comes in. This is my snare as it just was. And this is where the snare ended up. And this kind of brings me to my first point, which is if you were thinking like, hey, that doesn't feel like that much of a difference, I would agree with you. In solo, it doesn't really feel like that much of a difference, but it gets really interesting when I play it in the context of everything. So here's the original snare. And here's where it ended up. And I think the difference is a lot more pronounced when we actually hear it with the entirety of the rest of the music bed. It becomes punchier, it becomes a little bit more focused, and it feels a little bit more like what you would get from a 90s style snare, right? I kind of wanted that energy in. So the process for getting that was taking the original snare sound here and kind of doing two things at once. I was using the Slate Digital Transient Shaper and boosting into the Handsome Audio Zulu. The Handsome Audio Zulu is a hardware device. It's kind of meant to act like a tape machine, but without being a tape machine. It does some really interesting clipping and tone shaping, and so I'm using it as a soft clipper and pushing transient into the soft clipper to get the sound that I want. So if I just play it with the transient shaper, it sounds like this. So it's a lot less sustain driven, a lot punchier. But then when I throw it through Zulu, it ends up feeling a lot rounder. It brings some of that sustain back. It also focuses the energy a little bit away from the top and more into like the mids, where you get a little more power and a little bit more definition. So all in all, that comes out to be a pretty big difference. And then there's a little bit of a top end boost just to kind of bring some of the cut and sharpness back to it. So, okay, that takes care of the snare. Now, the next thing that I want to address is going to be the sample, because that's the biggest transformation I think that happens in the actual instrumental mixing. So this is a really thin sound. There's not a lot of other stuff happening in the record, and I don't mind leaving a ton of room for the vocals. I think that stylistically makes a lot of sense, but there's a lot of room to go. So everything I'm doing here is meant to fill out the sound, give it a little bit more low-mid energy. So the first move here is I'm taking out that frequency where everything's concentrated, which is like the upper mids, and then I'm pushing a little bit of lows and low mids, right? So pretty straightforward for what we're trying to do. A little bit more mid information on the sides just to widen things out. And then a little bit more love to that center mid-range just to give it a little bit more body and strength and presence. So that takes care of that. And here they are together. Before. All right, pretty thin. After. Lot fuller. So big improvement there. And then of course lastly we have the 808. So the 808 is probably the third key element in this record, and it sounds like this. So we have a ton of room in the bass range, right? Because our sample really isn't providing any bass. This 808 is mostly sub, but it's got some nice overtones in the bass range and in the mid range. So when I'm listening to this, I feel like, okay, we've got some space for that growl, that stuff that's in the mids, in the low mids, to just kind of come through and feel a little more aggressive. There's plenty of space in the record, let's fill it out. So I'm using a classic Weiss technique here. Basically, I think of the 808 in two parts. There's the attack of the 808, which is the punch, and that has plenty of mid-range energy, and then there's the sustain of the 808. The sustain of the 808 is where all the distortion characteristics start to show up, so I use multiband compression in order to keep the attack kind of sitting where it is, and turning the sustain mid-range up. Basically what I'm doing is every time the kick hits, I compress the attack of the 808, and I then push the overall signal back up to where the attack originally was level-wise. So the net effect is that the sustain ends up coming up. So here's a quick little before and after. So you hear all those growly textures start to show up, and that's what gives the 808 its personality, which is what, you know, a lot of what makes a record work, a hip hop record work, is the character of the 808. Hat doesn't change too much. I'm taking down a little 7K, which is kind of like the presence of the hat, and I'm adding a little bit of 14K with a very colorful EQ here. This is Ebony from Acoustica, and it sounds like this before and after. Just makes the hat stand up, and it actually makes the overall record just generally sound brighter. And then the last stuff is really just these percussion and open hat hits, and I didn't do anything to those other than set the level that I felt like worked best for the record, but there's no processing on those at all. So I kind of want to point out that there's a range of degree of processing going on. We have some slightly transformative processing in the snare. We have some significantly transformative processing and some in-depth processing on the sample. And then everything else is pretty minimal. And I think that one of the most important lessons to learn in mixing is that a lot of the times we really don't need to do much, if anything, right? No processing on the percussions at all. If something just sounds good, leave it be. It's hard to... we get the idea that we have to do a lot because when we watch tutorials, we're seeing somebody do something. You can't really make a tutorial out of not doing something, but in reality, not doing something is still just as much of a decision as doing doing something. Once you get very experienced with mixing, choosing not to do something versus choosing to change something is really no different in terms of difficulty. Like it's no harder really, unless something is like really messed up. Then that can be tricky. All right, and then the last thing I'm doing is a little bit weird, but I'm doing a little bit of carving and pushing of the low end and the mids. So here we go. Here's our before and after. And so you hear that the kind of all the mids and lows really come to life. I felt like the highs were pretty alive after I treated the hi-hat, but I wanted to get a little bit more body, fullness, energy out of the lows and to work out some of the mids here. So this is sort of a complicated EQ. It takes a minute to get used to because it's incorporating saturation into the EQ bands. It's the Black Box HGQ, which shows up a few times in this record, but mostly I'm using it to really get the low end to stick out, stand out. I've got a good saturation going on here, but I'm also doing a little bit of cutting to the bass. What I'm doing is kind of refocusing the energy into like the primary and sub bass range. And then in the mids, I'm also doing both some boosts and cuts where I'm pushing a little bit of like the aggressive tones around 2K, but I'm also cutting out some of the tones that are like right underneath that, and it ends up just pushing things into a better energy and also working better with the vocal. So that all brings me to the vocal, right? Let's start with what Method Man sounded like before any of my processing, just so we can kind of get there. All right, he sounds like this.
Block, got these rappers out here lying about the truth. Even though his family black, thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this is stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop.
So it's not a bad recording, but it's a little dull and it could use a little bit of like saturation, energy in there. And again, before setting off on doing this, I have to kind of decide what I want the end sound to be. Like, do I want to go super Wu-Tang where I would just probably leave it as is, right? So really minimal mixing, you know, maybe even distorting it on purpose, make it feel like it's going through, like doing like the Carlos Best thing where I'm just hitting that console really, really hard. Or do I want something that's more clean cut and modern? And like I said before, I ended up settling on kind of wanting both. So the first thing I wanted to do was just get the vocal cleaner so I can figure out where I was really going. So I end up controlling the mids, all that room tone stuff. I need that mid body to be there. I just don't want to like let it get to be excessive. So here I'm just controlling the low mids, making sure that they don't get out of whack. It sounds like this.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth. Even though his family black, thought he was lying about his roots.
Right, so it feels like a cut, but also not quite like a cut at the same time. And then some very, very simple shaping here.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth. Even though his family black, thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters.
Right, so that just kind of opens the vocal up, cleans it up a little bit. And then lastly, our good old friend here where I'm taking out some of the lows and then I'm adding in some of the highs and also saturating those highs to give it a little bit of air.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth. Even though his family black, thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this is stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop.
I also did a little bit of a time adjustment. I felt like his vocal, you're not hearing it right now. His vocal is aligned so that it doesn't sound like it's off, but the original placement of the vocal was more like this.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth. Even though his family black, thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth.
So it sounded just a little rushed to me for some reason, so I also used Time Adjuster to kind of lay it back a little bit. And then I committed that, and we end up with this.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth. Even though his family black, thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth.
So now I'm thinking to myself, okay, it sounds good, but I think it needs a little bit more body. I think it needs a little bit more character. What would I do if I was like going the other direction with it? And I decided I was going to use Zulu again, only this time I'm using it pretty aggressively. So I have this Handsome Audio Zulu Return here, and it sounds like this.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this the stairway to heaven.
So you can hear that it's got like it's very low mid weighted, like a lot of body to the sound, and it's also got a lot of hair in the upper mid range, like a lot of grit. And just the right amount of that tucked underneath the lead vocal seemed to work magic. So let me put those together here.
Got these rappers out here lying.
So here's without.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though.
Actually, let me level match real quick. So here's without.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots.
All right, and then here is with.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters.
Now let's hear it in the context.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this the stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop.
So this is kind of more of a mixing 201 concept than a mixing 101 concept, and it's something that I incorporate into my own style. It's something that I call hi-fi lo-fi. Hi-fi lo-fi is where you purposefully lo-fi something in any variety of ways. But, you know, in this particular case, by making it darker, by making it a little hashier, grittier, grainier, but in a way that feels good. So you get the lo-fi quality that gives it the character that you find compelling, interesting, works for the record. And then once you've got that, then you hi-fi it later. So you bring it into a more modern context. I've lo-fied it to a way that I feel is working, which is ultimately the main goal. And now I'm going to bring it back into this more hi-fi realm. So the first thing I'm doing here, once I've got the two sounds combined, is top end boost, bring some of that top end back, push some of the fuzzies and some of the harsher parts of the mid-range down a little bit, and then also get rid of some of the dirt and dust and clutter that's in the low mids. So here's our before and after.
They're lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this the stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop.
And that gets us pretty far. So now the last two steps are really just refining that, pulling out a little bit of mids. And the reason why I'm doing that is not because it feels too mid-rangey, but because I want it to sit at about the same level vocal-wise, but blend into the record a little bit more. So here's our before and after.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this the stairway to heaven.
And then lastly, we have this here. This is Vitamin, getting body into the low mids. So some of the low mid stuff that we cut out, this is just bringing back some of the energy there, but it's doing it in a way that's a little different than EQ. I find that Vitamin or FabFilter Saturn 2 can be used to sort of put energy in when you have to carve energy out. Like if you have like a lot of room tones and something like that in the mids, you pull out those room tones, then the mids start to feel anemic. So Vitamin or Saturn 2 can be used to restore body into those low mids without actually pushing the quantity of low mid up and bringing those room tones right back. So anyway, here's before and after on that.
Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this the stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop.
Okay, so I want to point out two other little things about this vocal before I wrap it up here. The first is the level of the vocal. The level of the vocal is loud. It's a little disproportionate, and it's supposed to be. There's something about certain rappers where when they're a little bit like almost ignorantly loud, it works for them. Rick Ross, Snoop Dogg, Method Man, I'm sure I could come up with more. Then there's rappers that work better when they're blended because they have a certain degree of bigness and energy to their voice and projection in their voice, like Busta, for example. He sounds really good when he's like pretty balanced with the track. Akon's not a rapper, but I work with him a lot. He sounds really good when he's balanced with the track because his voice cuts so much. And then there's certain rappers who are like so aggressive and so energized, like Lil Wayne or Meek Mills. They actually sound good when they're a little bit lower sometimes. Not always, but a little bit lower in the track than you might normally place things. And so every rapper has a different energy in their voice. With Method Man, sonically he sounds too loud, but energy-wise, feel of the record, I like how loud he sounds on this.
Gotta push it on the block. Got Got these rappers out here lying about the truth, even though his family black thought he was lying about his roots. And these two-faced gangsters out here lying about the truth. If this is stairway to heaven, leave them lying on the stoop.
I also want to point out that his vocal gets along with the snare drum really well at this level. Like, that combination of using Zulu on both the snare and the vocal kind of brings them together. The punch of the vocal the punch of the snare that I got complements the louder vocal. So there's a nice combination there that makes it still feel blended, even though his vocal is very loud. And then the last thing I want to point out is the reverb that I'm using on Method Man's voice. Ugh. Okay. The reverb that I'm using is no reverb. And this is, again, one of those things where it's like, it's hard to teach something that I don't do, but I set up a reverb to see if it would work. And for the most part, it didn't work because his voice, Method Man's voice, just sounds really good dry. It doesn't need reverb. No reverb is still a choice. It doesn't take any more or less skill than designing a reverb. It takes a little less time. But here you can see I already designed an ambient effect, it's delay actually, and then just ended up not really using it except for in one spot as a delay throw. So what I'm choosing not to do is also just as important as what I'm choosing to do. And that's the point that I wanted to make on that. So, all right, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. I'm not sure if Self-Hate by Sir Jones and Method Man is out at the time that this video is being released, but if it isn't, you're going to want to follow Sir Jones on Instagram. I'll put the link to his IG in the description below so that you can get notified when the record actually drops. It's a really, really dope record. I'm pretty thrilled about it. Plus, Method Man is a bucket list artist for me, so I'm really glad I got the chance to mix his vocal. And let's wrap this up by saying we are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.